All right, welcome to the Yeoman Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Graham. With me today is Russ Greene. Russ is the executive director of the Prime Mover Institute, and we'll hear more about Prime Mover Institute. They have a big focus on energy, and we'll be talking about that as well. But the reason I reached out to Russ was I wanted to chat with him about his recent article in the American Mind. I guess it was about maybe 3 months ago. The title is "What is Total Boomer Luxury Communism?" or as those in the know call it, TBLC for short. Russ has been, I've followed, before we started recording, I was trying to figure out how long we have kind of known each other on Twitter, and it has been a long time. He is incredibly insightful on all kinds of different areas, from culture to energy policy, which is a big focus of his work, ESG, AI, industrialization, sort of all kinds of things. And I've just found him, that's one of my favorite things about the platform, is there's just so many really interesting people there that I learn a lot from, Russ being one of them. And I guess maybe like 9 months ago, Russ, did you coin the term Total Boomer Luxury Communism? How long ago?
Yeah, I think it was last June.
So he started putting a name around this thing that we're going to spend some time on today. And that led, I think, to it getting a little more traction and attention in his article in the American Mind. But I'll stop there and start talking to Russ. I'll also say you can find Russ, as I did, on X. His name is Russ Greene with an E at the end. So his handle is Greene plus an E, just like it says, but Greene plus an E. It's easy to find. Russ Greene. Russ, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for having me on. Happy to be.
So I some things I hope we'll talk about. We'll start with TBLC, and then some other themes that we'll maybe meander through. You have a lot of great things to say, I think, about corporatism, ESG. I'd love to talk about ESG as it is now versus sort of how it's evolved when it started. Energy, your area of focus, and then related things, AI and industrialization. But we'll start with Total Boomer Luxury Communism. When I think about TBLC, and someone else shared this painting to describe it, I think of that painting. So it's probably because they shared it, but I think of that painting by Goya. It's Saturn devouring his son, and if you're listening or watching, you can probably remember this painting. It looks very modern. It's kind of scary and terrifying, though it was painted in the 1820s, and it shows Saturn devouring his son. And I think about that as this sort of fundamentally deep, and as a father, a parent, an adult, something deeply wrong with that. It's just deeply wrong. And I think you put words around that in a form of that Saturn devouring his son that's happening right now. So if you would please, at a high level, kind of describe Total Boomer Luxury Communism for us.
Yeah, no, it's a powerful painting that you mentioned, and several people have sort of made that point. I think it's because it shows how what's going on now, not just in America, but across the developed world, is really a betrayal or an inversion of the natural order. We understand that it's the job of a parent like you are, or the job of a father, to transmit culture and hopefully eventually wealth, property to their children, right? And in some ways that still happens, obviously. I don't want to be a total doomer about this. However, at the same time, I would say over the past 50 years, there's been a transition towards a different system where, the baby boomer generation first saw fit to sort of destroy rather than transmit culture. So we can see the decline in the institution of the family. We can see the decline in work, like labor participation rates among men falling, and also the decline in participation in organized religion, among many other strong indicators of cultural decline. Relatedly, and I'm sure the era of causation goes both ways, we've also seen, instead of a transmission of wealth from the older generation, the parents, to the children, we've seen that inverted, where wealth is being forcibly redistributed from younger working people upwards towards older people. And that's happening right now, but it's also a process that's going to continue. I'd like to remind people that we're going to be paying for these decisions our entire lives, because it's not just that we have to pay payroll taxes now or pay higher property taxes than we otherwise would in order to support privileges for senior citizens. That's part of it. But at the same time, the government has commitments going forward, whether that's interest payments on the debt or unfunded liabilities that just continue going up on autopilot going forward. In other words, our future incomes have already been committed. Mm-hmm. Not just our present incomes, but our future incomes have already been committed by older generations. So, I call it total boomer luxury communism. It's as we were discussing before we got started recording, it's not something that I'm an expert in. But on the other hand, if you think about what we're talking about here, it's such a wide-ranging field, like the field of all these senior privileges, that nobody really could be an expert in all of these things, because we're talking about property taxes, zoning at the local and state level. We're also talking about Social Security and Medicare and how the federal budget works. So it's really a monetary policy for sure. It's a way to tie together a whole bunch of disparate things.
Mm-hmm. You said something. You said a couple things I want to ask about. You said that beginning around 50 years ago, boomers chose something differently. Do you think there was is that a fair statement? That they chose a different path for us?
Well, I think I was talking about culture when I first said that. Yeah. And I do think it's fair to say that, beginning in the late 1960s and then definitely throughout the 70s, there were some pretty significant changes happening in American culture that baby boomers were sort of the vanguard of. On the other hand, and the show Mad Men is a great example of this. Also, some of that was the generation prior to the baby boomers, right? Mm-hmm. So definitely don't want to place all the blame on them. Nonetheless, it's pretty clear any trend you want to look at since 1970 relating to standard cultural institutions, whether it's how many people go to, some organized religious service on Sunday, to percentage of children born to intact families, the percentage of men who are prime age, so between 25 and 54, who are in the workforce. If you look at the trend, what's actually happened since 1970, all of these are going in the wrong direction. So, and I think it's pretty clearly tied to, number one, to some cultural changes that happened in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And then number two, to government programs that were either accelerated or created during that period as well. But again, to your point,
those were their parents, though. Is that?
Yeah. So to your point, that's their parents. LBJ would be hard to blame baby boomers specifically for the Great Society programs, Medicare and Medicaid. But on the other hand, right, I think it's important to remember that, theoretically, Congress can change these things at any time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. People say like, well, Russ, Social Security's from the 1930s, Medicare's and Medicaid are from the 1960s. Why are you focusing on the boomers? Well, because they benefited from these systems while it was clear that they were not sustainable financially, and they made no effort to do anything to reform them to make them more sustainable or make them more just.
I mean, that makes, I would say they came of age and came to ascended into their positions of power influence without reforming things that were clearly going to be problems.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, as you say, and as maybe we'll get into a little bit, intensified the absurdity of the inversion.
Yes.
And another point of clarification, or just to ask you, you said that kind of they haven't, how'd you put it, the kind of the wealth aspect of sort of handing down wealth. I can't remember your exact words.
Well, I was just saying, I think the irony is that normally we think that the wealth transmission goes in the opposite direction, that old people generously bestow upon younger people their property, right? And either upon death or even prior. And in return, it's a reciprocal relationship. The younger people return to them respect, praise, care, their presence, right? So sort of I don't want to say a trade, but it's a reciprocal relationship where the older people have more wealth and they have more wisdom, and they share it with younger people in exchange for their gratitude and honor.
Yeah.
Right. And that's been inverted, where I think younger people in a weird way have become like the moral authorities. Like we turn to people like Greta Thunberg or, everyone. I don't watch the Grammys, but like everyone's talking about the Grammys this week. Like people treat like 22-year-old celebrities like they're moral authorities, right? Instead of older people. Yeah. And then older people, instead of giving their wealth to younger people, are claiming the wealth of younger people. So we flip the natural order on its head.
I mean, that transfer, or that the natural order, I feel like, is still happening individually, like within families and loved ones, and certainly like that's happening. But societally, culture-wise, it's going the other way.
For sure. Yeah, there are still families that are.
There's a great transfer happening as boomers are dying. There's an enormous amount of wealth flowing.
That's true. However, I mean, also you can see some particular cases where very wealthy baby boomers are basically, or even Gen X will say, I'm not giving my kids a single dollar, and that's their choice. But, I think people are increasingly uneasy about the notion of inheritance. And I get it. But this is something Peter Thiel has spoken about too. He says he speaks to billionaire friends of his, like basically for what their plan is for inheritance, like what happens when you die. And none of them have really given it any deep thought, which is something that's something pretty scary because these, once you've built up an estate like that, you do have a responsibility to think about like, how's this going to live on after me, right? Mm-hmm. If you think about, for example, some of the largest nonprofits in America, whether it's the Hewlett Foundation or the Ford Foundation, these things can live on for like 50, 75 years after their founders passed. And also, at least in the case of the Ford Foundation, it seems pretty clear, they can diverge from the original intention of the founder, right? So I think long digression, my point is, I think even at the individual level, not the social or political level, we also are seeing some interesting evolutions in terms of how inheritance is working.
I hadn't thought about this till just now, but something that episode we have about to come out a couple friends and I talk about Against the Machine, Paul Kingsnorth's new book.
Yeah.
Have you come across that book?
I haven't read it, but I've heard about it. Yeah.
I recommend it.
Okay.
Or at the very least, I recommend you listen to our episode. But a theme that goes through there is this oikophobia, kind of a hatred or fear of one's home, where they come from, their culture, and even ourselves, like this. And I wonder if what you're describing there, this like reluctance to pass on, if it's another manifestation of sort of a self-loathing that comes with this sort of oikophobic zeitgeist that we seem to be having here in the West.
Yeah, for sure. Right. We don't know how to justify ourselves. We have all sorts of weird complexes around, like, this is stolen land and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I'm obviously, I know the history, but there's always some implication that there's some group somewhere else that is more, morally pure than we are. Yeah. And somehow we are the only ones that have conquered land or owned slaves in the past. Right. Yeah. As all those people, it's always funny to me because as soon as I hear someone talking about that, I'm like, oh, number one, I doubt you speak a foreign language. And if you do, I doubt you've studied their history, because I've studied Arabic, right? So I know the history of the Arabs. I read like 7th century Arabic documents. I know about the Ottoman and the Arab slave trades, and their conquests under Islam, so like the notion
slave trade
exactly. Yeah. So like the notion that like we can't have a culture because we are uniquely evil, or like we've done things that no one else has done, I've never found that persuasive. But
go ahead, finish that thought. Yeah.
But I also think, just in my own experience, it's not just ecophobia, but it's almost like there's an aspect of modernity that makes even knowing who you are more difficult. Like whether or not you accept it, because we move around. I know mobility in the United States has actually decreased for the past 50 years, but still we move around a lot more than someone would have 200, 300, 400 years ago. Right. So, for example, people ask me where I'm from. I never have a good answer to that. Right. Because, I was born in Princeton. I lived in Summit, New Jersey for about 10 years. Went to last 2 years of high school in California, went to college in Washington, D.C., went back to California. Now I've been back in Washington, D.C. So where am I from? I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that, right?
You do have a rootlessness about us.
Yeah, and there is something dissatisfying about it, and I don't regret like the fact that I moved here, but because in part, on the other hand, had I stayed like in California, my grandparents weren't there either. Right. Like, I think in order for that rootedness to really happen, it can't just be your nuclear family. I think it has to be a larger, either grandparents or cousins and aunts and uncles and all that in a single place. And that's just really hard to do these days. Maybe ironically, though, to your point about Kingsworth, maybe technology is going to make it easier because it won't matter as much that we be physically present all the time at our workplace.
I think it will. Maybe we come back to that, but I think it will go the other. I think technology is increasing the value of our in real life experiences and our attachment to things. It's calling and it's making in relief. It's whatever the term. Like it's making us more aware of what we do not have or what we would of our rootedness. I'm recording from a rural community, Glenville, North Carolina.
Okay.
In the mountains, and I have roots in Atlanta, Georgia, and years ago bought a piece of land up here and have been slowly and deliberately developing and expanding it to make it kind of a family place. And
good for you.
Love doing it. Kids love it. Like friends, it's just great. And I've gotten to know, I mean, as much as one can as a part-time person who's, from Atlanta up here, I have gotten to know a lot of the people in this small town. There are many, many generations of these people here. Names, the names of the roads right along here, the people's names, I know them. And my sense is they very much know where they're from. Like it's, I think it's actually a kind of an urbanite. This rootlessness thing is sort of a suburbanite and urbanite kind of thing. That is not, that there's still very much parts of America that are rooted.
That's true. This is a fault of people like me, which is that we tend to generalize based on our own experience, forgetting that, most people don't even graduate from college, let alone, go to college in a different place and then move somewhere else. So, yeah.
But a thing that has also happened at that same time is rural communities have gotten much poorer.
Yeah.
So unless you're in a kind of a bougie resort destination and have owned a bunch of land, like rural communities have not done well. But we're getting a little bit off. We're getting way off of total boomer luxury communism. And what we have,
it relates though. Like, sorry if I can interject,
right,
because if you look at the EIG, the Economic Innovation Group, they did a great map a year or two ago of what counties are net contributors versus recipients of government aid. And and it's so obvious that the rural counties are the largest net recipients of government aid, and the more urban counties are the largest net contributors. So, and that relates because the largest programs that are distributing government aid are senior targeted. So, Social Security and Medicare, and then seniors obviously also access Medicaid. So, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me, I haven't looked at the numbers on this recently, but it seems to me like not only are these rural communities more likely to be, in poverty or close to it, more likely to be dependent on the government, but they're also more likely to be on the older side of things as well.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Absolutely. I had a thought there that slipped my mind while you were saying that. Maybe it'll come back to me. We have not. So can we? You have 4 words in total boomer luxury communism.
Yeah.
I think we understand the boomer part.
Yeah.
And explain the other 3 parts.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with luxury because that's what tends to surprise people the most, because they say rightly that, look, not every baby boomer is wealthy. Certainly true. Different estimates, but it's something like 1 in 5 are millionaires in terms of their net worth. What the luxury part is denoting is that benefits for seniors are different from how government aid works for other age groups, in that they like Social Security, for example, the largest Social Security benefits go to the wealthiest people, right? That's not how most government aid works. Usually government aid is targeted towards lower income, more disadvantaged people, right? So most people have no idea how much people can be getting from the government through senior benefits. So for example, I tell people this and that they disagree with me, and I just send them a link to the Social Security website. You can be getting over $60,000 a year from Social Security if you've maxed out your lifetime income. And you also, I think you have to wait until you're 70 to collect, but people do both those things. And, so think about it. If that's a household, 2 people, that's over $120,000 a year just from Social Security. In addition to
not counting Medicare.
Exactly. Not counting Medicare. And, one of the excuses often is like, we paid in. Well, if you add up everything that seniors are getting on average from Social Security and Medicare, they're getting back way more than they contributed. And how much more depends on, how exactly you calculate the net present value of things and all that. But point is, they're getting a lot of money, and a lot of them don't really need it, right? They're well off. They're millionaires or multimillionaires. And, also there's a whole bunch of abuse. So but that's Social Security, right? There's a whole bunch of abuse also in Medicare, a whole bunch of waste and abuse. Some of that is driven by these health insurance companies that are just milking the system, like United Health, for example. There was a report from, I think it was House Judiciary Committee last year, just looking at how basically health insurance companies, including United Health, spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to make their patients in Medicare Advantage seem sicker than they actually are so they can bill the government more. Mm-hmm. In addition, because these companies are getting such generous payouts from the government through Medicare Advantage programs, some of them are like legitimately offering seniors taxpayer subsidized luxury benefits, right? That's not an exaggeration. Like, what are we talking about? I've seen horseback riding, tennis lessons, greens fees, golf balls, pet food, hair appointments, transportation, meals, all covered by taxpayer funded Medicare programs. So
and on the one side, you might be like, well, I think it's good that, people have these great things. But then on the other, you're like, but how is this funded? Who's paying for it?
Yeah.
Where does the money come from? And it's very much a picture of Saturn devouring his son.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these programs are already unsustainable, so, for the easiest way to sort of focus someone's mind in DC is to just remind them that the Social Security Trust Fund is running out in, most likely 2032. The Medicare Trust Fund is running out in 2033. On the other hand, Medicare is already being paid for out of general funds to a very large degree. So it's basically contributing to nearly $500 billion every year in deficit spending right now, right? And that's going to continue to get worse. You can look at projections of total Medicare costs over the next 10 years. I saw, and nobody knows for sure, so I don't want to sound like this is certain. Congress can change it, economic conditions can change, but still the projection I saw was from about $1 trillion a year to over $1.9 trillion a year. So basically doubling in a decade. I mean, that's crazy. And that's due to both the aging of the population, but also per person spending going up.
And as you note there, it's funded with deficit spending.
Yes.
Which is a burden both on younger people and even more terribly on people who have not yet been born and who have no political voice to object to the weight they're going to be obligated to carry around.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just in other words, it's not just a one-time payment. Right. And I said in my piece in American Mind that there's like 3 or 4 ways that this is costing younger generations. So one is obvious, one, taxes, but then, the debt is more complicated than people think because, first of all, you're eventually going to have to pay that in taxes. You're also going to have to pay interest on it. The interest in the deficit spending, it crowds out other government services. It also crowds out economic growth, right? So the economy is already growing than it would if we had less debt, meaning that young people and people yet to be born will earn less their entire lives due to this debt. In addition, having this much debt, especially when you look at the projections over the next 30 or 40 years, that is going to drive up the mortgage payments that people can expect to buy a house because they're going to have higher interest payments. And it's also going to lead to inflation because the temptation is always going to be for the Fed to just, print this problem away. So, people are getting squeezed by these programs now and will continue to be in many more ways than they're, for the most part, aware of. So, I mean, that's sort of the reason I've been spending so much time, even though it's not my job, to call attention to this is I don't think most people know how expensive these programs are and how generous they are to especially retired millionaires. And they have no idea what the downstream consequences of that are, and not just what they are right now, but what they will continue to be for decades to come.
Well, you also have shared, I've listened to a couple interviews and other things you've written. You also have some thoughts like, hey, we could do this. It's not hopeless. Before we get to that, though, I don't want to skip the communism part, because this is, it is both mind-blowing to me and infuriating. If I can ask you to describe the communism aspect of Total Boomer Luxury Communism.
Yeah, I mean, this is, so besides the luxury, this is the other one that sort of took people by surprise, because they tend to think of America, not as a, total anarcho-capitalist country, but certainly as a capitalist or free market country, especially if you compare us to, China or Western Europe.
Sure.
And what I point out in my piece, and also I found some interesting numbers afterwards, is the numbers don't really back that up, at least not to the extent that people think. So if you look at social programs or social benefits in China as a percentage of GDP, it's hard to get hard and fast numbers, but it's about 10%. In the United States, it's over 20%. So we're spending twice as much as a share of our economy.
It's our per capita GDP.
I haven't even gone to per capita yet. Yeah, that's just the share of the economy. But now that is actually understating how much more we spend on social benefits than communist China does, because we have a larger economy per person. Right. About 3 times as large. Okay, right. Yeah. So my conservative estimate, I've run these numbers past a couple different AIs, and I've looked into this, and it's, my conservative estimate is 6 times as much per person wealth redistribution through social programs is happening in the United States as opposed to communist China. I've also, been looking more recently into how our per capita social benefits in the U.S. compare to other OECD nations. Yeah. And we actually also spend more per person than many countries that we would think of as, socialist or more left-leaning than us. So Canada, the UK, Australia, the Netherlands, I think, I'd have to check on this, but I think even some of the Nordic countries too.
Now, you shared yesterday, right? I saw a chart you shared yesterday, or maybe the day before, that really underscored that. And I meant to print it out so we could talk about it, but it's.
You know what? I'm just gonna pull it up because it's pretty easy to find. Hold on. And I want to speak precisely about this.
You have to scroll. Yeah, here it is. Tweets. So there's like 38,000 tweets you have to scroll to before you.
I got it. Okay, social welfare spending. And this is from Wikipedia, but I found it in other sources as well. Similar conclusions. So per capita dollars, the United States was ranked 11th at constant or at current. So that would be 2024 dollars, roughly $15,293 per person. But, here are the nations that we're ahead of: Iceland, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and Japan. I mean, that's just striking that, people often refer to the U.S. as having no safety net or no social programs. And it's just untrue. I mean, now there's a more sophisticated, and Musa El-Garbi, who's a very interesting commentator, I recommend everyone check him out. He had a post about this week, which is that the reason people reach that conclusion is they don't look at the amount we spend on social programs. They look at universally available services delivered.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So we have fewer universally available services because most of our stuff is targeted at senior citizens, not everyone else. And we like to run things, sometimes justifiably, but not always, through middlemen. So health insurance companies or nonprofits or people administering these programs, which of course, skims off the top. Yeah. So, and still, it's shocking how much money we're spending because we have this self-image that we're like this enterprising, rugged individual, free market society, right? And the irony is, like, the baby boomers especially, they get so mad when I point this out. They call me the communist, or they call me the socialist, right? They say, you want to make Social Security socialist, right? And it's like, wait, you're getting money from the government. I think you should get less money from the government, and I'm the Marxist, right? Yeah. But there is this sense of entitlement that they have and it was, to be fair, it was designed this way. And this is what they were told by politicians. It was never the truth, but they were told.
I mean, the politician promised them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I have to say, and I find myself doing this too, and I think it's terrible. So I'm calling out myself in this. I think I often paint with a broad brush in my humors, and I want to go ahead and put the disclaimer that my view is boomerism is best understood not as an age bracket or a generation, but as a state of mind, and it is embodied by that Goya painting. But anybody can be a boomer. And there are people in the boomer age bracket who are, passionate critics of boomerism and champions of anti-boomerism. So I want to just go ahead and put that out there. So when I am critiquing boomers, I'm critiquing boomerism, not individually.
I thoroughly agree. And I hope my parents and in-laws are also listening. But yeah, I mean, I refer to people being spiritually boomer.
Yeah.
So, but, what is that? I think the Goya painting encapsulates some of it. David Brooks had a book come out in the year 2000 called Bobos in Paradise.
Oh, yeah, I remember that book. Yeah.
Yeah. In Bobos, it's a weird term, but it stands for bourgeois bohemians. And that's sort of the paradox of the baby boomer generation and of boomerism in general. It's encapsulated in that book. I mean, David Brooks himself in many ways actually exemplifies this, right? There's this strange tension in the baby boomer generation between bourgeois values and bohemian values, right? So they very much identify, even on the right, with individualists, like rock music, Vietnam era music and culture, and even drugs, and you see that in libertarians or even conservatives just as much as you do in left-wing people. At the same time, though, it's also been fused or synthesized in a way with this egoistic drive for consumption, right? And in a sense of personal entitlement and a desire to be freed from any sort of outside social bonds or constraints. And that's, but at the same time, they still had families, they still, took positions of authority in government, and they still had leadership positions. So there's always this strange tension. There has been this strange tension in American society where nobody wants to admit that they're in charge, right? It's the shirking of authority,
Mhm.
right? Like everyone acts like, and Barack Obama did this, but Republicans do this as well. Like everyone acts like they don't have any authority, even when they do, right? It's like, yeah, sure, I was in office, but there's nothing I could do. It was the blob, or it was the deep state, or whoever. It's like, nobody wants to take responsibility, right? And I think that aspect of the boomer ethos is really important to highlight, which is that it's this combination of a drive for power with a denial of any authority or responsibility.
Do you think, and I think this we'll have one more little departure before we get into some, I think, like practical thoughts about how we can step back from the abyss. But it just occurred to me to ask then, do you think schooling and the way schooling evolved in the kind of the post-war era, kind of the organization man, institutionalization, all these sorts of things had some impact? Like I was promised if I followed all these rules and I did all these things, then I would become anointed and then became deserving. And because this is kind of, the boomers are probably maybe the silent generation as well, but they were the first to really go through an extremely institutionalized society.
Right.
And I wonder if that has colored that mentality.
Yeah. Well, for one, it weakened their bonds with their families,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Because,
yeah.
I mean, because their families had less of a role in education, even if their families had chosen a particular private school or religious school to send them to, that would have at least been a choice reflecting and resonating with the family's values. When you send the kid to public school, that relationship doesn't exist.
Certainly, like the political, cultural, business leaders were more likely to leave home for school, go far away, even if many boomers did not. They were sort of part of that.
Yes.
Thing.
Yeah, but also, I think there's a certain, well, there were two things. One is when you are forced as a young kid to be in a single place you don't want to be almost every single day, from 7:45 to 2:45, and then if you do sports, it's maybe till 5 or 6, and then go home and do homework. This notion of like the atomic individual, unconstrained by tradition or norms, it becomes more appealing, right? Even if in a strange way, it's also what the system is trying to turn you into, right? That there's always this weird paradox where it's sort of like, am I rebelling, or am I really just a product of what the system wants? Also at the same time, it gave schools an ability to sort of shape a single narrative around America. And not just schools, but if you think about like the formative institutions in baby boomers' lives, you'd have to include, CBS and CNN, and, until relatively late in their lives, they had this mainstream consensus, authoritative media outlet. So you have this combination of, at the personal level, this unconstrained atomic individual, and then above them, this mass mainstream regime, and very little like mediating institutions like extended family or a religious community, right, or a town that you've grown up in. Very little mediating institutions in between them. And I'm not saying anything original here. Yuval Levin has talked about this as well. And he's also talked about how, and I think this is a really important point, it ties back to something you said earlier, because of the demographic dominance of the baby boomers and also therefore their political and economic power, they not only established a certain narrative around America and their role in it, but they have gotten all of us, everyone else, to sort of see America through boomer eyes. And that's almost a direct quote from Yuval Levin. He said that in The Fractured Republic. He said that 10 years ago. So that's one of the most prescient and well-observing points I think anyone's made in American politics.
Are you aware of the fourth turning stuff, the generational stuff?
Yes.
Yeah. We've never talked about that, or I've never seen you comment on it. Do you have any thoughts on that as it relates to this?
I dug into that a little bit. I'll way
oversimplify this. And it's been years since I really looked at it, but it kind of came back on people were talking about it recently. But to oversimplify, and Russ, correct me if I have this wrong, it's essentially the, strong men make good times make weak men, right. Weak men make bad times, that sort of cycle type thing. And that's oversimplifying, because I think it gives some great attribute to every generation in there that gives something to the next, but it talks about a cycle. Do you think that's a fair summary?
Yeah, that resonates with what I've heard about it. I didn't read the full book, and I'm often skeptical about people who try to become too social scientific about these things. The other thing I would point out too, and I'm guilty of this up until now in this conversation, is that it can be difficult to generalize about an entire generation. And often just like we think that our own personal experiences are from a position of privilege are representative of the whole country, even if they're not. Mm-hmm. I think we often tend to impose certain generalizations on generations. So, if you think about the average baby boomer, and Christopher Caldwell's written about this, in The Age of Entitlement, but, it's not as if, every baby boomer was at Woodstock or out in the streets, protesting the Vietnam War. That was the defining generational experience for maybe 10 or, 15% of them. Right. But a lot of them were just normal people. That being said, it was certainly the dominant narrative in media and sort of the dominant, culture for baby boomers who went on to positions of power because they went through college.
Yeah. They went through college, and they were probably the first real generation for which that meant they were maybe the only, I don't know, I'm probably oversimplifying, but that cemented their status as the group that did that and went through those things, cemented their status as the leaders of the country, generation, businesses, so forth.
Yeah, and they did that during a period when, I hate the term meritocracy. I think it's a terrible word, but there was more of a move towards meritocracy during that period where, the Ivy Leagues became less of a country club for WASPs, started taking standardized tests more seriously. And as a result of that, they attracted a broader student body, but also people who graduated from those institutions had a sense of earned privilege, right? That if you graduated from Harvard and, or Yale in 1970, as opposed to 1920, you would have felt not that you owed your country something, but that it owed you something because you had demonstrated superior merit. So I think that's an important change too. On the generational thing, real quick, that reminds me of, I mentioned Arabic earlier, someone I've thought about a lot in terms of these generational questions is Ibn Khaldun, who was a, North African, writing in the 14th century. And he had a theory of the rise and decline of civilizations that was based on generational transmission. And he generally, it sounds like it's similar to the fourth turning thesis. He generally thought this was a 4-generation process where the first generation, they're the conquerors. They're nomads. They're coming from the plains. They were raised tough. They come in, they conquer, and then they raise their kids, in a fairly disciplined way because they came from nothing themselves. By the time their kids, grow up, they were raised by that first generation. So they might not be as disciplined themselves or as austere, but still they were raised in that environment. They raise the third generation. That third generation now is 2 steps removed from difficulty. And by the time you get to the fourth generation, luxury has essentially corrupted their morals to the extent that, basically they don't have what Ibn Khaldun calls asabiya, which is, you could translate that as solidarity or tribal instinct, right? It's the willingness to sacrifice for the community.
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of people, I think, in the modern era think that that's extinct or unnecessary. But, on the other hand, I think we're seeing, when asabiya and when trust and communal spirit, Republican virtue, when those decline, that doesn't just make us feel worse, but it actually has concrete material consequences. It impacts our prosperity. It impacts our security in pretty detrimental ways, because you need, at the end of the day, for society to survive in a concrete sense, you need leaders who are willing to put the good of the community ahead of their own self-interest. And you also need people who are willing to, take up vocations like being a policeman or being a doctor or being a school teacher, that require them to have some sense of virtue. And as I think part of what we're seeing is, as asabiya declines from one generation to another, we are not able to fully compensate for it with superior money or superior technology.
Are you that kind of, as you were describing what he was describing, I was thinking immediately of Genghis Khan and Genghis Khan's children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren, and that was exactly describing what happened with them. And I think it was either Genghis Khan or one of his children who did the whole arrows breaking it thing, and like, hey, we got to stick together. But then they all atomized and began to squabble and break apart.
Yeah. So Ibn Khaldun met one of the descendants of Genghis Khan, actually, in Syria, on a diplomatic delegation. I believe it was Kublai Khan. It's been several years since I read about this, but so he clearly was thinking about that. He also has a section. He has basically a whole history of the world, and part of it is about the Mongols. He was basically trying to do scientific history like in the 14th century with the tools he had.
That's so amazing.
Yeah.
14th century Northern Africa.
Yeah.
Scholar.
Yeah.
Observer of humanity. That's fascinating.
I mean, he's also thinking about ancient Arab or early Muslim history. He's thinking about Al-Andalus, so the Muslim kingdoms in Spain, and also, just what he's seeing around him in Muslim North Africa at the time, which also, you were seeing that basically the Arabs conquer Spain initially in the 8th century, but by the 14th century, they've been declining for a long time, and they're going to be kicked out, by the 15th century. So, he can sort of reflect on these processes and how, he's not saying that like every nation is going to collapse after 4 generations, because there can be a process of renewal, but there needs to be some sort of insertion of a new regime or a new dynasty, so to speak, of basically people who do have asabiya, who are willing to sacrifice personally for the good of the group. And you can't just get that. I think this relates to total boomer luxury communism, because a lot of what conservatives do seems to be just sort of preaching at people about this stuff, like an Edmund Burke reading group. And I love Edmund Burke, and I love reading groups. And if there were an Edmund Burke reading group near me, I would probably go to it. So I'm not trying to hate on it, but like preaching to people about the need to have a social contract, not just between me and the government, but like across generations, and speaking about the duties and obligations we have across, from one generation to another, both from younger people to older people, between the previous generations and us today, and then future generations. You can preach to people about that. But if your entire society is set up economically and materially to break those bonds, it's not going to be very effective.
Yeah.
Right. And if you think about how, welfare in many ways encourage the breakup of families, because people sort of would replace a husband, or they were even encouraged to replace a husband with the government. In a similar way, Social Security and Medicare are sort of breaking the bonds across generations, because instead of parents thinking of their children as the people who will support them as they get older and basically investing into them, they're encouraged to invest into the government and then look to the government to take care of them. And even worse, they're deluded to think that this makes them independent.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They don't think of themselves as welfare recipients. They don't think of themselves as being dependent on the government, even though they are. The way the system has been set up based on lies, it deludes them into thinking that, I'm basically just getting my Social Security and Medicare money back.
That's saved all my life.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the way we've set America up, due to total boomer luxury communism, is at war with and directly contrary to all of the principles that conservatives, normally talk about.
Have you, over the last few days, I've been paying attention to Helen Andrews. Do you follow Helen Andrews?
I read her feminization piece. She's been going off recently about, I think, Chinese Americans.
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to.
Yeah.
And standardized tests, and and studying really and performing well. And something occurred to me. She hadn't written about this angle, but it relates back to the sacrifice, commitment, being a part of a community thing.
Yeah.
I was thinking about the rise, because I haven't read it too closely, but I gather she's pretty complementary to the kind of standardized testing culture and individual academic performance and all these sorts of things. And she observed that Asian education systems tend not to make team sports a big part of their programs, whereas Americans do. And that little thing that she shared made me think about the standardized testing thing. Like, if we're over the last, when have those become important? Over the last 50, 70 years, if you optimize for the standardized test, then the standardized test becomes your signal of your status in society and how well you do. What a standardized test does not measure, and is not asked to measure, and is not a part of it, it's not how well you've contributed to your team or your community or your loyalty, or you might not be a upper decile performer on a standardized test, but you could very well be that member of your team, your unit, your church, family, or whatever, that is the glue that enables it to be successful and productive.
Yeah.
And optimizing for that standardized test, which I gather is sort of essentially what she's saying Asian education systems do and American education systems maybe ought to do, is teaching people to be, I don't know if selfish is the right word, but completely to optimize for their own performance without regard to the performance of the people who are around them.
So that's interesting, because my impression of her, and I only saw her on social media, but I thought she was criticizing the Asian approach. I thought she was saying that excessive focus on effort and like concrete results at the expense of passion and social bonds was harmful.
Oh, well, okay. Well, then,
yeah, that was my impression.
Okay, yeah. Well, then maybe she has done that, and I just I took a couple comments she had where she seemed to be sort of not making a judgment, but just saying. Actually, I think she did say at one point, like, the truth is probably we need some of this and we need some of this, and the things I was, and so that's I'm probably completely misrepresenting her position on that, but I think I'm accurately describing the standardized testing versus the American style thing.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting though that I guess the Chinese, they do have a strong sense of asabiya, right, or whatever you want to call it. Solidarity. They have an expectation, for example, that not just an expectation, a requirement by decree that if you as a Chinese citizen, any Chinese citizen, are called on to spy or acts of sabotage or what have you.
It's like
I forget what it's called, but I was just listening to a podcast about this. Yeah, and like they have to do it; they don't have a choice, right? And,
or if they're here, if their family members will suffer consequences if they don't do it.
Yeah. So I'm sure that chafes at some people, but on the other hand, it seems like a lot of Chinese people have just sort of accepted this system. I mean, it is true in a sense that they have a more collectivist society, definitely less concerned with individual rights. So perhaps, they're able to focus on standardized tests to such an extent because they're not necessarily counting on higher education to instill these values. They're getting it from other places. Also, like when we talked earlier about how they just spend much less money on social programs. Like, what does that mean? And one of the things it means is there's going to be much more of an expectation of the generations taking care of each other.
Mm-hmm.
Helping, parents helping raise kids, but also kids once their parents are older, having them live in the house or, so there's, my impression of Chinese culture, I don't have numbers on this, but my impression is they have more intergenerational solidarity.
I think that sounds, I mean, I don't know much, but that sounds right to me, just knowing a number of families and seeing how strong those bonds are. And I would say it's only been in the last couple decades that they've begun to have the type of geographic mobility that Americans have had for a long time. And I wonder how those bonds will persevere in the face of sort of really rapid urbanization.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Like if you look at, if you look at the social policy of China, or you look at the political theories that seem to inspire them, they're in a strange way, despite being communist, also socially conservative, right? This is a country where you can get in trouble for the meal you post on Instagram because it's decadent, right? You can, male celebrities can get in trouble with the government for looking too feminine on TV. And, they've also sort of, they've really made an effort to understand Western liberalism and modernity, and especially the culture of America, how that's manifested itself in America. Wang Huning, for example, is one of the chief, you could call him a theorist, you could call him a propagandist, of the Chinese Communist Party. I certainly wouldn't want to say that he, and I don't know that he's sort of the intellectual behind Xi Jinping, but he's certainly influential. And he wrote a book, America Against America, based on his travels in America, which was also fairly. It was influenced by Alexis de Tocqueville and also by Alan Bloom and sort of that circle of Straussian political theorists who he would have come in contact with in the 1980s. And he very much sees that even back then, he sees that the cultural foundations of America are weak. And this sort of creates a paradoxical dilemma for China, which is that China wants to adopt some aspects of the modern West. Like they definitely want our technology and they definitely want to learn from our corporations and, some aspects of our financial markets. But they want to do so without this social and cultural, what they see as decay, right?
Yeah. Well, I, with regard to decay, this may be a good time to get to the more kind of practical step back from the edge part of what we do. I mean, well, here I'll just say, there's a comment you shared with me, and we were on X when we were going back and forth about this topic. And I'll read your quote and then ask you to elaborate on it a little bit more.
Yeah.
With regard to Total Boomer Luxury Communism and what we might do. And I think you were actually maybe responding to me and be like, don't be such a doomer, where there's things that we can do to
yeah.
And you said, we could accomplish the legitimate purpose of Social Security, keeping seniors out of poverty at much lower cost to GDP. That would be a decent thing for us to do and cost only 1/4 of the current program. That's as far as I would go. And meaning, like, I think in response to doing some super extreme things.
Mm-hmm.
But I would take any compromise that curtails spending growth. So you clearly have ideas about how what we could do. Be compassionate citizens and fulfill our mutual obligations to our fellow citizens of every age, but do so as responsibly as we can, I guess. Can you elaborate on some things?
Yes. So a couple things. One, I don't have the technical chops to come up with the Russ Greene solution to these problems. No one, as I said earlier, no one could be an expert on everything from property taxes to Social Security to Medicare to the federal budget process. And another key point would be we could just sit here and pontificate around what the ideal approach to entitlement reform is, and we should do things like that. But at the end of the day, it's going to take practical political deliberation and compromises to actually achieve reform here. And I accept that, right? I'm not like an anarcho-capitalist who thinks any amount of Social Security is unjust because taxation is theft. And therefore anything short of like totally getting rid of it is unacceptable. Not only do I not think that, I do think that some amount of Social Security or a Social Security-like program is a positive good. So the question is, how do we have that without all these negative effects that we've been talking about? I think the most reasonable way to go about that and to do so in a way that is fiscally responsible, but also politically feasible, looks something like what Andrew Biggs has proposed at the American Enterprise Institute. And he basically is looking at the question, what happens when the Social Security Trust Fund runs out of money? So the Social Security Trust Fund, which is funded by prior surpluses that were invested in treasury bonds. So basically one part of the government giving an IOU to the other part of the government. When that runs out, which it's expected to do in about 6 years, by law, there are automatic benefit cuts, about 21, 22%, that will take place. And what Biggs at the American Enterprise Institute proposes is concentrating that impact at the higher income group, the top quintile, in order to spare everyone else. Turns out if you do that, 80% of people are actually better off than if you did an across the board 21% cut. So the way he describes it, he's basically just flattening Social Security benefits. So right now, people can get at the high end over $5,000 a month. He would take that maximum down to $2,500 or so. And, the impact of that is anyone who's relying on Social Security to stay out of poverty is going to continue to get that benefit. Some people might even be getting more than they would otherwise under his approach. But it does mean that we are going to have to tell people who are expecting to get, maybe 55, 60,000 a year just from Social Security. Sorry, you're going to get a little bit or a lot, in some cases, less than that. There's some anxiety around that, which we can get into because people feel like that's dishonest in some way. But then on the Medicare side, there's no one silver bullet with Medicare. It's got 4 parts. The one I've been looking at recently is Part C, which is Medicare Advantage. There actually have been some positive signs from the Trump administration that they understand the problem here. So in my Total Boomer Luxury Communism piece, I refer to the abuse of Medicare Advantage and how it's used to buy seniors, as I mentioned earlier, golf and tennis and horseback riding lessons. They announced, I think it was last week, if not last week, the week before, that they proposed a rule where they're going to, first of all, hold Medicare Advantage payments to insurers flat, as opposed to increasing them, which the increase was expected to be 5 or 6% this year. And they're also going to look at ways to curtail Medicare Advantage overpayments to insurers, which is estimated to cost over $1 trillion over the next 10 years. So that's very encouraging from the Trump administration. However, that's just one thing. There's going to need to be reforms to every single aspect of Medicare. I'm not a Medicare expert, but again, I would support anything that changes the spending growth of these programs, because it's not just where they are now. It's the fact that because Congress has failed to do its job, it's set these programs on autopilot, that they just have this cancerous metastatic growth that just happens without anyone doing anything, right? And when you look at what that is going to do to our country over the next 30 to 50 years, it's truly catastrophic. So we have to get off this train, and the sooner we do it, the better. I understand that's going to take some political compromises. The last thing I'll say about that is, I'm trying to address an asymmetry that I've observed, which is that the baby boomers are mobilized, first of all, they're aware of their interests and they're mobilized through AARP and other organizations to defend them viciously, and they're very good at it. I heard, for example, from a Senate staffer, basically, we love what you're doing, we agree with it, but, our boss is too afraid of the baby boomers to say anything publicly right now, but keep saying it. So on the baby boomer side, they're very mobilized.
Level stuff, and then you also have state level stuff with regard to a state level with regard to property taxes.
Yeah, but let me finish this on the federal level. So we have to fix that asymmetry fundamentally before we get to 0 hour 2032, 2033, when the trust funds run out. We have to do a better job of mobilizing people who are not senior citizens to defend their interests, because otherwise we're not going to have a seat at the table. And this problem, these trust fund shortfalls and the general unsustainability, of these programs is going to be solved entirely to our detriment. They're going to preserve, what they're going to try to do is preserve or even increase benefits for senior citizens by taxing us and imposing more debt on us. So unless we mobilize and also just make people more aware of what's going on and what's going to happen, we are going to be the losers here. You're absolutely right. State level, I haven't even gotten into that. You're seeing the exact same thing at the state level. So, I commented on an ad by Dan Patrick. I think he's lieutenant governor, running for lieutenant governor in Texas, yesterday. And, basically Texas is trying to cancel property taxes for senior citizens, right? And I understand people have objections to property taxes, but if you have objections to property taxes or you think they're too high, why are you just sparing senior citizens? Because the effectual reality of that is if you hold spending constant and you absolve one group from paying taxes, that just means you're shifting more of the tax burden to everyone else, right? Why are we taking the group that has the most wealth, most likely to own a home, they don't have any expenses associated with raising kids, and they're not working, and we're saying we want to not only bestow trillions of dollars in government aid on you, but absolve you from any tax burden? I mean, that's crazy. And
the group who has already benefited from people who are older than them paying for their things that they say they shouldn't have to pay for now. There is a bit of the whole bullied people become bullies sort of thing. And I worry, I'm the best Generation X. And I'm like, are we going to turn into boomers? I guess it doesn't matter because there's only 9 of us, but are we going to be this thing that we look at and are so alarmed by, this, Saturn devouring a sun type thing that we see 25 years from now? Are we going to be doing that, behaving that same way? Are we going to find ourselves in the position where our immediate self-interest is overriding our sense of what's good, right, and proper? Or the millennials? I'm guessing you're a millennial, is that right?
Yeah, I am a millennial. Yeah, I'm 39. So I guess I'm on the older side of millennials. But I mean, we should be realists about this in a sense, which is that, generations are always going to have disagreements, and there is a single generation will advocate for its own interests, at least to a degree. However, I just don't think that the way things are set up now is sustainable. So even if morally Gen Xers or millennials were on that path of depravity, I don't even think we're going to have the option, right? The era of free money is over.
You say that makes obvious, intuitive sense to me. Essentially, eventually you run out of oxygen or gravity. We have to obey the laws of physics or whatever. And I spoke with Chuck Marone of Strong Towns a couple episodes ago, and I think it might have been after we stopped recording, but Total Boomer Luxury Communism came up, and he was familiar with it. And it was in a different context. It was right recording. He thinks that it'll just you can keep kicking the can down the road forever somehow. We didn't really get into that.
I don't think that's right because of inflation.
Yeah.
And also because of bond markets.
I mean, Chuck is a pretty smart guy, so I wanted to hear more from him about that. But we never got into it. But I'm kind of with you. It can't go on forever. Thing you said about the power of the boomer generation from its political power right now. An area that I look at and I'm like, things can change. I look at the success of, I would say the early success, but to me, early and real successes of what might be very broadly called the YIMBY movement with regard to to zoning liberalization across the country in both red and blue states, whether it's Montana or California, people being like, yeah, we this is not good for young people, and it may be good for older people who already own their homes, but it's not good for young people, and we got to put an end to it. And that seems heartening to me, the effectiveness that broad movement has had. What's your take on that?
Yes, absolutely. And housing is a large piece of this. Kevin Erdman at the Mercatus Center has written some good stuff about this. He had a piece recently.
Mercatus, friend of the show. We've talked to a number of Mercatus people.
And Kevin's argument is that, when housing prices increase, but the housing stock is staying relatively constant, and you have basically neighborhoods of the same homes are costing more. And as a result, a home that might have had a middle-class person in it 30 years ago now has an upper-class person in it. That is a sign of poverty, not of wealth. Because fundamentally what it indicates is we have a shortage of housing, which is a scarcity problem. It's not a luxury problem. So in other words, a lot of people's, what feels to them like an increase in wealth in America, which is the inflation of home values, is actually happening through a process that's more indicative of poverty. So that's a really significant mindset shift. Obviously, zoning is a large piece of that. It's not the only piece of it. As I talk about in my piece, like we have policies that are basically designed to keep old people from selling their homes as long as possible.
Yeah, I'm in real estate, and I should have known this. You introduced me to the term NORC.
Yes.
That was new to me.
Yes, naturally occurring retirement communities. Yeah, so people have this norm that like it's somehow more like nobody really seems to care if a young family can't afford a new house. But if an old person living by themselves ever has to sell their house, that's terrible. And it's not that sometimes people will respond and say, look, there's not a housing shortage, and they'll show some national numbers, right? But what they're missing is, as it's a cliche, but like location, right? A young person or a young family, they need to be in particular places. They need to be near major employers. They need to be in safe neighborhoods. There's several cities that it's very beneficial for them to be in. If you have this housing supply in those particular locations being dominated by senior citizens who are being subsidized to stay there and not sell, that means you have senior citizens in homes that are nearer to major employers and more convenient otherwise than they would be living in under market conditions. So on the YIMBY point, yes, it is a sign of optimism. You could also mention the abundance movement in general. But
I don't know if there's a good term to lump all of those things together, but
yeah. But, I still, and I haven't read the abundance book, so that's partly on me, but with the exception of Alex Stapp, I haven't seen anyone sort of in the abundance movement, like really talking about total boomer luxury communism. I mean, funny though, you can see Ezra Klein from like 10, 12 years ago. He basically says, our federal government is spending all this money on old people and nothing on younger people. That's weird. And then he's basically stopped talking about it for the next 10 years. Hopefully he'll start talking about it again. I guess the one exception is Matt Iglesias. He's covered my work, and he basically said, like, look, at the end of the day, might disagree with Russ on politics, but factually, this is what's going on here. It's a massive wealth transfer from one generation to another, and that's bad. We should have or at the very least, it's bad that we're doing this blindly. We're engaging in this massive wealth transfer. Nobody really seems to know what's going on, and we've had no political deliberation about it. That's very unhealthy politically. So we should have a discussion about it. So I think there is an opening there for sort of a, building off of some of the concerns that the YIMBY movement people and abundance people have around housing. Also, this ties into the natalism discourse, right? Like if you're pro-family, how pro-family is it to transfer wealth from young families to people who are retired and empty nesters, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like the opposite of family policy. So, and I've gotten some good responses from the family people. And, I'd also say if you're more of like a nationalist or someone who's interested in industrial policy or things like that, we also have to understand, like, the federal government can only raise so much revenue efficiently from taxation. And if we are spending currently like 3/4 of that budget on interest payments on the debt and on these mandatory social programs, that share is rising every year. That's crowding out everything else. So whatever it is that you care about, whether it's science funding or subsidies for industry or defense spending or what have you, whether you realize it or not, you have an enemy, and that is the cancerous growth of these social programs.
You made that point very clearly in the article and elsewhere, but it's we sense there's this great like political divide in America, but really there's only like the squabbling over how we're spending money is only over 15% of the budget. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's hard to say exactly how much. I mean, so it's 75% or it's 74%. It is not appropriated by Congress. So it basically, some people call that autopilot spending. That means Congress doesn't have to go through a formal review and appropriations process every year. It just sort of just happens, right? So that's Social Security, Medicare, interest payments on the debt, et cetera. In addition, the reason it's more than 75%, I estimated 85%, is, even most radical members of Congress, for the most part, they're not talking about zeroing out the defense budget, right? Or, they don't think we should spend $0 on food stamps, right? They might want to cut it a little bit. But there is also a certain level of what's called discretionary spending. So non-social spending, non-payments on the debt, that there also is a bipartisan consensus over. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest ironies of this era, which is that we have this perception based on media and on a relatively narrow slice of issues that we are more divided than we've ever been. But, if you actually look at concrete policy issues, there really isn't that wide of a difference in terms of what people actually want to do with the federal government between the two parties. And I think that's bad. I think we should be more polarized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
More discussion, more disagreement.
Yeah. I mean,
really more action from Congress. So
yeah, more. And we've sort of accepted the structures that were built in the New Deal and in the post-war era, and they're not suited for 21st century America. They're not suited for the era of AI.
They probably weren't suited for 1945 America.
Right. And we're not even really having a fundamental discussion around like, how should we rebuild these things? And, and I'm not to say like, I'm not someone who wants to start with a blank slate, but on the other hand, I do think it would be helpful if we had more radical, big picture thinking around like, who do we want to be as a nation? Like if, I don't necessarily think we should design a budget this way, but like if we were to like remove all of the legacy programs and were to just start from a $0 budget today for the federal government, what should the federal government spend money on? It's almost impossible that we would actually arrive at our current distribution of funds, right?
Yeah.
Given the problems we have, with demographics, with the military, et cetera. One more thing on the, because I should have mentioned this earlier. You mentioned Chuck Marohn and how he's skeptical of, whether the data is actually a problem. I think the important thing
like it's a problem. He felt like it could be delayed for a long time.
I, these are compounding issues, right? So part of it's not just that we have to spend a lot of money on our debt and on these social programs. It's that the more we focus, money is just a way of directing human energy, right? And the more we direct our human energy towards social transfers and interest payments on the debt, that comes at the expense of everything else. So we are less prepared. Right. I think we saw that with COVID. If you look at things like our nuclear arsenal right now, our ability to enrich uranium, you look at things like our ability to build ships for the Navy and to maintain them, our munitions stockpiles, our ability to fight a war, all these things have been degraded. And if you look at other aspects beyond defense, other aspects of American infrastructure, such as the electricity grid, for example, we're just not in a very good state right now. Most regions of the United States and Canada are at elevated risk of blackouts and electricity shortages over the next 10 years. So it's not just the narrow financial aspect of this. It's that we really, a lot of this comes back to like Nassim Taleb, right? Like we basically have these clustering risks. One of them is just a debt crisis, but a recession and hyperinflation, but then also just like infrastructure collapse. And if any one of those things happens, it makes the others more likely. So yeah. I'm a little less, I don't know if you want to call it optimistic, but a little more cautious, I would say, than Chuck is. And that doesn't mean I'm saying any of this is definitely going to happen, but I'm a little more concerned about it.
I would, yeah, I don't want to misrepresent what Chuck said. I would not say he was optimistic about that. He is very optimistic about young people, extremely optimistic about young people and the direction of change with regard to his areas of focus on land use and things like that. He was, if anything, maybe concerned that we could continue down this terrible fiscal path much longer before we could dig a much deeper hole before being pressured to change. I mean, I guess Japan kind of has, like Dominic Pino at the Washington Post has written about this, and Japan has just a massive debt load, much larger than ours. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they haven't collapsed, but on the other hand, their economy really slowed down and they just aren't the same kind of nation that America is, right? They are living, under our security umbrella, right? So it's not just that we have a large and increasing debt load, but that's paired with commitments we've made around the world and just to maintaining, the world trade order, whatever you want to call it, like the world security and trade system. People used to call it the liberal international order. I think that's a little silly, but like nonetheless, it is true that American might in money enable a lot of other countries around the world to sort of depend on us. Mm-hmm. They also have given American consumers the ability to live lifestyles that might not otherwise be possible. And, therefore, I think like we should be looking at historical analogies, like what's happened to other countries in similar situations. One similar one would be post-war Britain and the British Empire. They thought they could sort of just maintain their empire forever and just weather the debt they'd incurred from World War II. They were wrong about that. And it took them, I guess, until the Suez crisis and what was that, 56, 57 to really, definitively realize that. But, we could be, if we continue down this path, we could be heading towards, a similar sort of difficult realization where just like a lot of things we took for granted about America and America's role in the world would be called into question. So for that reason, I don't think that we could have the sort of
like soft stagnation or soft decline that Japan and nations like that have achieved?
I have an added concern. It's that I still want to talk to you about some things you just mentioned, or military, energy, AI kind of related to energy, reindustrialization, the sort of the evolution of ESG, and then a very yeoman specific topic of corporatism.
Yeah.
And yet I feel like I feel like that needs to come in a part 2 of this conversation. Would you be up for that?
Yes, I look forward to it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so then we will continue this hopefully sometime soon, or else this would be I think maybe a 4-hour episode.
Joe Rogan style.
Yeah. That's right. So my guest today has been Russ Greene. I've been thrilled to have you, Russ. I love speaking with you. Russ, again, is the executive director of the Prime Mover Institute. You can find Russ on X at Green plus NE. I encourage you to do that. Russ, any other places you'd point? And you can find his piece in The American Mind. I recommend you read it. Any other places you would point us to?
No, that's it. Yeah.
All right. Well, Russ, great to see you again. Glad to be with you.
All right. Thanks for your time.